script, oral health and the natural path. I start in silence. Because, honestly, that's how it all begins. Not with unbearable pain. Not with an emergency. Not with the kind of signal that makes you stop whatever you're doing and say, I need to get to the dentist right now. No. It starts with a discomfort that's almost too small to notice. A mild twinge when you drink something cold. A sensitivity when you chew on the left side. A tingling that comes and goes. Something so small, so fleeting, that you learn to live with it. You unconsciously adjust your entire eating routine around it. You learn to chew on the other side. You learn to avoid ice cream, cold water, anything carbonated, that tougher piece of meat that would press directly on that spot. You start ordering your coffee warm instead of iced. You skip the salads that require real chewing. You make 100 tiny accommodations without even realizing you're making them. And then one day you look back and realize you've been quietly rearranging your life around a toothache for 6 months. I did the same thing. I ignored it for weeks. Then for months. I kept putting off that appointment I was going to book this week, which never actually happened. Because there was always something more urgent, more important, more real than that twinge that showed up and disappeared. A work deadline. A family thing. Travel. Money. The standard excuses that feel completely legitimate until the moment they no longer are. Until the day it didn't disappear anymore. Until the day that discomfort turned into a deep, throbbing, constant pain. A pain that radiated up through my jaw and into my ear. A pain that wouldn't let me sleep. A pain that woke me up at 3 in the morning with my hand already pressed against my face before I was even fully conscious. A pain that made it absolutely impossible to pretend it wasn't there. And it was exactly at that moment, sitting there in the dark, waiting for the painkiller to kick in, exhausted and frustrated, that I heard the sentence millions of people hear every day. You're going to need a root canal. 5 words. And something inside me froze. It wasn't just the fear of the procedure itself, although that fear was absolutely there. The drill. The injections. The hours in the chair. The cost. The recovery. All of that was swirling around. But underneath all of it was something else, a question I couldn't shake, one that echoed in my head for days after that appointment. How did something so small get to this point? How did a tiny, ignorable discomfort turn into a pain that robbed me of sleep for weeks? How did I let it get here? And more than that, could this have been prevented? Is there really no other path from here? Am I just going to keep patching things up, one procedure at a time, for the rest of my life? Those questions wouldn't leave me alone. And so, instead of just scheduling the root canal and moving on, I did something I hadn't done before. I stopped, and I started to actually investigate. Not frantically, not with the anxiety of someone desperately looking for a quick escape from an uncomfortable reality, but almost like a personal, quiet search. Methodical. Patient. I wanted to understand what was actually happening inside my mouth, not just treat the effect, but trace it back to the origin. Not just put out the fire, but understand why it started. And more importantly, understand what kind of environment allowed it to spread so far before I even noticed. And the deeper I went, the clearer one thing became. The problem rarely starts in the tooth. It starts earlier. Much earlier. It starts in the habits we've normalized over years, sometimes over decades. It starts in an inflammatory diet, loaded with refined sugars and ultra-processed foods, that creates a systematically hostile oral environment day after day. It starts in the chronic dehydration that reduces saliva flow, and saliva, as it turns out, is one of the mouth's primary natural defense mechanisms. It starts in the neglect of simple, almost invisible signals, a slightly swollen gum one morning that you blame on brushing too hard, occasional bleeding when you floss that you've come to treat as just a normal part of the process, a sensitivity that comes and goes and never feels urgent enough to actually do something about. Signals the body sends regularly. signals we've learned to dismiss. And here's something that genuinely stopped me in my tracks once I started to truly understand it. The gums are not just a support structure for your teeth. They're not just that pink tissue sitting around the roots. The gums are living tissue. Highly vascularized, meaning they have an extensive network of blood vessels running through them. Densely innervated, meaning they are full of nerve endings designed to detect change and communicate it. They are, in a very real sense, one of the most responsive tissues in the entire human body. Sensitive to everything that happens in your system. Chronic stress, hormonal fluctuations, diet quality, the state of your immune system, the quality of your sleep, even your breathing patterns. When the gums weaken, and they weaken silently, progressively, almost imperceptibly, often over years, they open the door to something invisible but extremely aggressive. Bacterial buildup. And we're not talking about surface bacteria that you wipe away with a couple of minutes of brushing. We're talking about bacterial biofilms. Organized communities of microorganisms that penetrate deep into the gum pockets, that adhere to surfaces in ways that make them highly resistant to mechanical removal, that settle into areas no brush or floss can consistently reach, and that create an environment of low-grade chronic inflammation. Bacteria that secrete toxins as a byproduct of their metabolism. That slowly compromise the surrounding tissue. That, over time, carve a direct pathway toward the deeper structures of the tooth, the cementum, the dentin, eventually the pulp. And once they reach the pulp, the conversation changes completely. First comes the sensitivity. That's the early warning, the one most people notice and dismiss. Then comes the localized pain. Sharper. More consistent. Harder to ignore, but still manageable enough that most people find ways to work around it. Then comes the inflammation of the pulp. At this stage the nerve is involved. The pain becomes constant, throbbing, disproportionate. Sleep becomes difficult. Normal daily function becomes genuinely impaired. Then, increasingly invasive procedures. Root canal. Crown. In more advanced cases, extraction, implant, bridge. That's the standard progression. That's the path most people follow without ever realizing they're on it, because no one ever sat them down and explained what was happening at each stage and what could still have been done differently. Nobody teaches us to read these signals while they're still reversible. And that gap in knowledge is expensive, financially, physically, and in quality of life. And it was exactly at that point in my investigation that something inside me started to shift. Not overnight. Not in a single dramatic moment of clarity. It was subtler than that. It was a shift in the question I was asking. I stopped asking only, how do I treat this problem right now, and started asking something different. Something deeper. How does the body recover? What does tissue actually need to repair itself? What is missing from my oral environment that keeps this cycle repeating? What am I doing, or not doing, every single day that is either supporting or undermining the tissue in my mouth? That shift in questioning opened a door I had never seriously walked through before, the role of nature in supporting oral health. Now, I want to be clear about something before we go further. I am not talking about magic solutions. I'm not talking about replacing professional dental care with home remedies and hoping for the best. I'm not that person, and this is not that kind of conversation. What I am talking about is something more nuanced, more evidence-grounded. The recognition that the body has its own sophisticated mechanisms of response, of recovery, of self-regulation. And that those mechanisms can be actively supported, or, when we consistently ignore the signals and keep feeding the problem, systematically undermined. The science is not new here. Researchers have been documenting for decades that certain bioactive molecules found in plants have a measurable ability to interact with the body's inflammatory pathways. Not in the blunt, aggressive way that a pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory works, suppressing a response that the body actually needs, but in a more modulating, intelligent way. interacting with the specific signaling molecules that drive chronic tissue inflammation, reducing the conditions that favor aggressive bacterial colonization, supporting the cellular processes involved in tissue repair and regeneration. These are not fringe claims. They appear in peer-reviewed journals. They are being studied with increasing methodological rigor, and they point toward something that dentists and researchers alike are beginning to take more seriously. The idea that the oral microbiome, the complex ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms living in your mouth, can be meaningfully influenced by what you do and what you use every single day. And that's where my investigation led me to something specific. A particular plant. Simple. Widely available. Nothing rare or expensive or difficult to access. A leaf whose compounds have been drawing serious scientific attention for 3 characteristics that are directly relevant to everything I was dealing with. Documented anti-inflammatory action in gingival tissue, measurable antibacterial effect against the specific strains most associated with periodontal disease, and, the part that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it, early but compelling evidence of potential support for gum tissue regeneration. Not regrowth from nothing. Not reversal of severe bone loss. But at the level of soft tissue inflammation, compromised cellular environment, and early-stage recession, real, measurable, biological support for the body's own repair processes. I was skeptical. Of course I was. Anyone with a functioning critical mind should be skeptical of a claim like that. But skepticism doesn't mean dismissal. It means investigation. And the more I investigated, the more the mechanism made sense. Because here's the key insight that reframed everything for me: gum inflammation is not the problem. It is the signal that there is a problem. It is the body's attempt to contain damage that is already underway. So when you focus only on suppressing the inflammation without addressing what's driving it, you are quite literally silencing the alarm while the fire keeps burning. The inflammation is there because bacteria are there. The bacteria are there because the environment, the pH, the moisture balance, the microbial composition, the immune response in the tissue, has shifted in their favor. And that shift happened because of things that have been accumulating over months or years. So the path forward is not just to suppress the symptom. The path is to change the environment. To make the mouth a less hospitable place for the bacteria driving the damage. To reduce the chronic inflammatory load that is keeping the tissue in a constant state of stress. And to give the body the specific compounds it needs to shift from a state of ongoing breakdown toward a state of repair. That's where natural compounds with antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties earn their place, not as a replacement for anything, but as a meaningful part of changing the conditions that allowed the problem to develop in the first place. If you're going through any version of this, tooth pain that comes and goes, gums that bleed when you brush, swelling that shows up and disappears, chronic sensitivity, the nagging fear that you're heading toward something worse, I want you to know something important. You are not powerless in this. You have more influence over what happens in your mouth than you've probably been told. I've left a practical guide in the first link in the description. Everything I gathered throughout this investigation, organized in a clear and accessible way. It's free. Click there and take a look whenever you're ready. But let me keep going, because what I want to talk about now goes beyond any single ingredient or compound. The most important thing I discovered through all of this research is not a plant. It's a principle. The body is not passive. The body does not simply deteriorate and wait for external intervention to fix it. The body is constantly working, actively, dynamically, to maintain equilibrium, to repair damage, to fight infection, to restore balance. And it does this work every single moment, whether you're aware of it or not. What most of us don't understand, because no one teaches us this, is that our daily habits are either supporting that work or making it dramatically harder. When you eat a diet that drives chronic inflammation, you are forcing your immune system to spend enormous resources managing that systemic inflammatory load, resources that are then unavailable for localized tissue repair in your gums. When you breathe primarily through your mouth, especially at night, you are drying out the oral mucosa, reducing the protective properties of saliva and creating exactly the kind of environment where pathogenic bacteria thrive. When you rush through your oral hygiene in 90 seconds without real attention to technique, you are consistently leaving the same deposits in the same areas, day after day, allowing biofilm to mature and calcify into forms that become progressively harder to disrupt. When you go months or years without addressing the early signals your body is sending, that occasional bleeding, that sensitivity, that gum that looks a little more receded than it used to, you are allowing a reversible process to become an irreversible one. And when you finally do pay attention, when you reduce the inflammatory diet, when you address the mouth breathing, when you upgrade your hygiene technique, when you introduce targeted natural compounds that actively support tissue health, something remarkable happens. The body responds. Not with miracles. Not overnight. But in ways that are real, measurable, and sustainable. I started noticing it in small ways at first. Less sensitivity when I ate. Less bleeding when I brushed, which I had genuinely come to accept as normal after years of it just happening every single time. A different quality to the feeling of my gums. Firmer. Less puffy. Less raw. Less like something that was constantly on the verge of being aggravated by whatever I did next. And then something more subtle but perhaps more meaningful. The anxiety started to lift. That low-level background dread, the one that says it's only a matter of time before this gets worse, began to quiet down. Not because I told myself it was fine when it wasn't, but because things were genuinely, observably getting better. That shift, from the feeling of inevitable decline to a feeling of actual forward movement, is something I did not expect to value as much as I do. Because the psychological weight of dental fear and dental avoidance is something that doesn't get talked about enough. It affects how people eat, how they speak, how they smile, how they engage socially. It creates a constant low-grade stress that compounds over time. And when you start to feel that weight lifting, when you start to feel like you are actually steering the situation rather than just being dragged along by it, the effect extends far beyond your mouth. There is a massive gray zone in oral health that most people are never told about. On one end of the spectrum, you have perfect oral health, healthy gums, no decay, no sensitivity, no issues. On the other end, you have conditions that genuinely require professional intervention. Deep infections, advanced bone loss, structural damage that cannot be reversed by any natural approach. But between those two ends is an enormous middle ground. Chronic mild inflammation. Early-stage gum recession. Persistent sensitivity. Elevated bacterial load. The beginning of the process that, if left unaddressed, will eventually reach the end of the spectrum that requires the procedure you're dreading. Most people in that middle zone are told one of two things. Either everything looks fine, keep brushing, when things are clearly not fine, or you're going to need X procedure, when the situation has already crossed a threshold that could have been interrupted much earlier. What almost nobody is told is, here is what is actually happening in your tissue right now, here is why it's happening, here is what you can do at home to meaningfully change the trajectory, and here is what to watch for to know whether those things are working. That information gap is where the damage compounds. Not because people don't care about their teeth, but because they don't have the framework to understand what they're dealing with until it becomes a crisis. The gums have genuine regenerative capacity at the soft tissue level. Tissue that is chronically inflamed and compromised can, under the right conditions, shift back toward a healthier baseline. The key phrase is, under the right conditions. And creating those conditions is something you have far more control over than you've probably been led to believe. The oral microbiome is modifiable. The bacterial population in your mouth is not fixed. It responds to changes in diet, hygiene, pH, immune function, and the specific compounds you introduce. Targeted natural antimicrobials, particularly those with documented activity against periodontal pathogens, can meaningfully shift the balance of that ecosystem over time. Chronic systemic inflammation directly impairs oral tissue healing. What you eat, how you sleep, how you manage stress, and how active your immune system is all directly affect how well your gum tissue can respond to and recover from bacterial challenge. You cannot optimize your oral health in isolation from the rest of your physiology. The mouth is not a separate system. And the converse is equally true. Poor oral health drives systemic inflammation. The bacterial load in a periodontally compromised mouth doesn't stay in the mouth. It enters the bloodstream. It contributes to inflammatory processes throughout the body. The connection between gum disease and cardiovascular risk is one of the more robust findings in modern medicine. Your mouth is not a closed system. What happens there matters for everything else. So let me leave you with the core thing I want you to carry forward from this video. The single biggest shift in my entire journey was not discovering a specific plant or following a specific protocol. It was learning to listen to the body before it has to escalate the conversation to a level I can no longer ignore. Most of us have been trained to only respond to crisis, to only make the appointment when the pain is unbearable, to only pay attention to the body when it is screaming so loudly that ignoring it is simply no longer an option. But the body doesn't start with screaming. It starts with whispers. A slight puffiness in the gum tissue that disappears after a day. A sensitivity to temperature that wasn't there 6 months ago. A trace of pink in the sink when you rinse after brushing. A dull ache that comes and goes without a clear pattern. A feeling that something is subtly different, subtly off, subtly more fragile than it used to be. Those are not random inconveniences. Those are communications. The body running a constant internal diagnostic and flagging the results in the only language it has. And every time we override those signals, every time we say, it's probably nothing, every time we promise ourselves we'll get it checked next month and then don't, we are not making the problem go away. We are just making it quieter for a little while longer, while it continues to develop below the surface. Learning to hear those early signals. Learning to respond to them with curiosity and deliberate action rather than dismissal and avoidance. That is the real practice. And it is a practice. It develops over time. It requires attention. It requires a genuine willingness to be honest with yourself about what you're noticing. But once you start, it changes the entire dynamic of how you relate to your health. You stop being the person who shows up every couple of years for damage control. You become someone who is actively engaged in maintaining the conditions that keep serious damage from occurring in the first place. Inflammation is not your enemy. Never forget that. Inflammation is a response. The immune system doing exactly what it is designed to do, detecting a threat and mobilizing resources to contain it. The problem is not that your body is inflaming. The problem is that the threat hasn't been removed, so the inflammation has no reason to resolve. It just keeps burning, quietly, day after day, slowly degrading the tissue it was originally trying to protect. Remove the threat. Support the tissue. Give the body the compounds and the conditions it needs to shift from defense mode into repair mode. That is the entire framework. Everything else is an application of it. If this resonated with you, if you're ready to stop reacting and start understanding, subscribe to this channel. Because this is just the beginning. The next videos are going to go deeper. The specific compounds with the strongest evidence for oral tissue support, the gut-gum connection that almost no one talks about, what your daily diet is doing to your oral microbiome right now, and how to build a routine that actually addresses root causes. The next step starts here. See you in the next video.